Buonasera a tutti, good evening and welcome to the Italian Radio Hour. Io sono Viviana and I would like to welcome back our regular listeners and also welcome any new listeners. Also be sure to like us on Instagram and Facebook at the Italian Radio Hour and subscribe to our YouTube channel to catch up on any past video interviews. Vorrei dare il benvenuto ai nostri ascoltatori da tutto il mondo, grazie per essere con noi anche oggi mentre continuiamo il nostro viaggio per l'Italia e la cultura italiana. I'm so excited for the guests and the conversation that we're going to have today. Longtime friend, we started as a student teacher. Linda Schifino. She's a writer living in Pittsburgh. She has recently published a book that will take especially people in Pittsburgh back to memory lane in the 50s and Larimer Avenue, The Neighborhood Girl. And we will engage in a conversation that will lead us through some of the characters that impacted Linda's growing up in this neighborhood, and maybe even tracing some parallels with little Italies of other cities. I'm sure some of the stories or the colors and the flavors of Linda's Italy in Pittsburgh might be similar to other little Italies. And the big question of what do we do with our Italianità once the generations move on and adopt new traditions? But before that, pubblicità. Parli italiano? Do you want to learn, improve, or master your Italian? Istituto Mondo Italiano can help. Located in the heart of Regent Square, Istituto Mondo Italiano offers small group classes and one-on-one private tutoring to help you learn Italian in no time. Visit us online at www.istitutomondoitaliano.org. Well, Istituto Mondo Italiano is indeed where Linda and I met.
Yes.
Linda, welcome to the program. How are you today?
I'm doing great. It's so nice to see you, Viviana. Thank you for having me.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's totally love it. It is indeed to celebrate the success of a lady that I feel strong esteem for. And also a personal curiosity, because once I came to Pittsburgh, Larimer Avenue was a thing of the past. So having someone that has firsthand memories growing that neighborhood, as I said, totally selfish motive at that point. I could not but invite you to join us in the program. Before we start to talk about the neighborhood girl, Linda, would you like to share something about your background?
Sure. I was born and raised and still live in Pittsburgh. I'm a writer now living in Pittsburgh, but I'm a retired academic. I have a PhD in rhetoric from Duquesne, and I taught communication at Carlow University for some years. And when I retired from teaching, I started creative writing. And I decided if I was going to do that, I wanted to do it well. So I went back to Carlow and got an MFA. And that experience is what produced the stories that ultimately became Neighborhood Girl. But I'm still, in spite of a PhD or an MFA, I am a neighborhood girl, an Italian-American neighborhood girl from Larimer Avenue, from East Liberty. That's in my soul who I still am.
What was the time span, or, you started to write these creative essays that ultimately ended up in the book. When did the process start?
I would say about 5 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I had a little granddaughter at the time. And I was visiting with her one day, and after I dropped her off, I was driving along Washington Boulevard, and there's a place where you can take a turn and go into the old Larimer Avenue neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
And something drew me there. I haven't drove down that street in so many years, I don't even remember. And I just was compelled to drive, and I went down the street, and it was nothing but vacant lots and grass that was knee-high. And all of the buildings of my childhood were gone. And Viviana, I had to pull my car over and put my head on the steering wheel And I wept like a little kid. I sobbed. And I thought, this is gone. My mother and father are gone. My aunt and uncle are gone. All of the old neighbors are gone. How will I ever share this wonderful childhood with my little granddaughter?
Mhm.
And I thought, well, I'm going to have to tell her these stories. And I thought, well, she's not going to remember. I'll write them down. And I started writing stories. And that was the impetus of it.
Well, that's probably the biggest gift that you could do to her and to all of us. So starting with little Alex, if I remember
Yes, little Alex.
correct.
And the book is
Little-
dedicated to her.
Mhm. And so because there are many people that will find themselves in your pages. So let's talk a little bit about where your family came from originally. And was it Pittsburgh, their first the city where everyone settled, or was it a second or third destination?
No, the best that I can tell, they settled here in Western Pennsylvania. Initially, they were up in Oil City,
Mhm.
which I guess there were jobs there. And then my grandfather was a landscape gardener, and he came to Pittsburgh, he and my grandmother, probably, I'm guessing it was like maybe in the 1910s or 20s. And he worked for Mr. Benedum. He was Mr. Benedum's gardener.
Ah,
And so my family settled in Pittsburgh, and this is my mother's side, which is what I really write mostly about. It was the family that I knew mostly. My father's family was all gone before I was born. So my mother's side of the family is my grandfather was Altieri, like you, and
yes, and we kind of we have to investigate that a little further
I think
because
so.
some of the things and the places that we exchange over time
Yeah.
are indeed common. So
Yeah, and on my grandmother's side, DeSantis and Pompa. But what I discovered, Viviana, is for 250 years, both of my mother's parents, my grandmother and grandfather, came from a little town in the Provincia di Foggia, in the province of Foggia, and I've traced them back to the mid 1700s. They stayed in that little town until they emigrated here to Western Pennsylvania and to Pittsburgh, and settled in the Larimer Avenue neighborhood where many Italian at the time, that was Little Italy.
mhm. So for those of us that are trying to picture and imagine what life was on Larimer Avenue, and again, for those who are not in Pittsburgh, is this very long street. Tell us how vibrant or the life was at that time. What are some of the activities that you would encounter in the streets, whether there were bodegas, grocerias, or anything like that?
This was a close-knit community, predominantly Italian American. And I can imagine that it is no different than small Italian American communities that you might find in Brooklyn, in New Jersey, in most of this northeastern part of the country. It was a working class community. These were very few people owned a car. There was a streetcar, which is how we got to do shopping. The street was populated with grocery stores, a butcher shop, a bakery, and so on. You know, Stagno's Bakery, Pompa's Grocery, Mr. Caraza's grocery store. And our apartment was upstairs from that grocery store. And a lot of the people that I knew lived in small, cramped apartments upstairs from all of these stores. And just to tell you a little story that explains how close this community was. Mr. Carrazza, who owned the grocery store and who owned the building where our apartment was, where we lived, had a ledger book. And you would go in and you would get whatever groceries you needed. And Mr. Carrazza would look at them and he would mark in the ledger book and you would take your groceries. There was never money exchanged.
Mhm.
On payday, the housewives would come and they would say, "What do I owe Mr. Carrazza?" They trusted him. And he would say, "Well, you owe this." And they almost always only had a fraction of what was on the ledger book. I know the page with my mother's name at the top, always had a balance. And thinking of that now, it breaks my heart. But
Yeah.
this was the way this man operated. And once a month, on the first of the month, my mother and I would go downstairs and to pay the rent in cash. Mr. Carrazza took it. He never counted it. He put it in a little leather pouch. My mother would never insult him by asking for a receipt.
Mhm.
This was the level of trust and community and love.
Mhm.
And as poor as we were, I didn't know we were poor. This was an absolutely beautiful childhood and a lovely way to grow up.
Indeed, because it's filled with values that you had all your needs taken care of, your basic needs, and it's not about having more stuff, but
No.
indeed the trust in someone by their word, having people that care for you. Because I'm sure if your family were in difficulty, this Mr. Carrazza would have done anything to
Yes.
ensure that your family would be able to survive. But it does take some time to really appreciate that. I
Yes,
find myself in that process where, whether at that age we're not observant, we just take it as the way that things are done. But then when that world is gone, or we become parents, grandparents, so we're trying to instill good values in the new generation, we realize, how important that trust, that type of human rapport, because basically we're talking about humanity in these in all these characters, is indeed priceless.
Yes. And there was
Tell-
joy too, Viviana. I mean, there was the St. Rocco Festival and the
Yes.
parade. And, we would go to Mass in the morning and they would bring out the St. Rocco statue on the float, and, the St. Rocco and pulling back his robe to show the scar on his leg and his little dog at the feet. And here at our Heinz History Center in the Italian American collection, they have the original St.
Indeed.
Rocco statue
Mhm.
that was donated by the Costa family. That was the statue from my childhood on Larimer Avenue. And then
Yes.
there would be the procession, and that night we would all go to the big club yard, and there would be a bandstand, and the people of the neighborhood, we would be singing and dancing, and there would be wine and pizza and cannolis, and there was a lot of joy in this neighborhood too.
Was the the communities, the Italian communities in the neighborhood, were they coming from predominantly certain regions? There was a little potpourri of
there was probably a little potpourri of regions, but mostly in the South. Most of the people came, some came from the Puglia region where my family came from, but there were also people from, there were Abruzzese people and from Basilicata and just mostly those southern regions, but they did come from different parts of the South. We didn't know anything about Northern Italy or know anyone who came from Northern Italy.
Yeah, but even with the southern regions or any region, you go from one town to another and traditions are different, or the dialect is different and so forth. So it's nice to being able to be, having been exposed to, the traditions, whether it's food traditions or the language of the others. Were there like any funny characters or some characters that were really important in your development as a child, as a girl, that you would like to mention?
Well, I think I have to mention my great-grandfather, Urbano. He was a funny character in good ways and not so good ways. Urbano liked his wine, and he would go to the Italian Brotherhood Beneficial Association, the IBBA, which was 2 doors. No, it was next door to our building. And sometimes the men from the IBBA would get drunk and they'd be out in the street. And if the windows were open in the summer, my father would get out of bed and tromp down the steps. And my mother would say, no, let it go. They'll stop. And my dad would go down and scold them. But my great-grandfather was one of the men. And he would start singing so loud that eventually he would get thrown out. And
Oh,
sometimes they would call my mother and say, come and get your grandfather. He was my great-grandfather, and walk
mhm.
him home. But at the St. Rocco Festival, when there was the music on the bandstand and they were playing Italian music, there was always a point in the evening that my great-grandfather Urbano would have enough wine in him that he would want to sing O Sole Mio, and he would stagger up to the steps and onto the stage and grab at the microphone. And that's when my mother would say, okay, time to go. And she'd grab my hand and I'd say, no, I want to hear him sing. She was out of there. She did not want to be embarrassed by this man. So he was a wonderful character. He loved me. I adored him. I mean, he always smelled like cigars and wine, and he had a bristly mustache, but I thought he was magnificent. And
Mhm.
I would spend time at my grandmother's house. He lived with my grandmother, his daughter, and we would spend time in her garden in the back. And he taught me the tarantella. He taught me Italian songs. And he was a wonderful, adoring character in my growing up. But when I mentioned him to my mother, she would always roll her eyes and say, oh my God, this
No,
man.
no.
But the funny anecdote, I still now take care of his grave. I take care of all of the graves of my ancestors back to 1919 up at Mount Carmel Cemetery. But my great-grandfather Urbano's grave, grass would not grow. And for months and months, my dad and my uncle would try to get grass, and they would say he's just too ornery. And they finally just had to buy sod and put sod on it because it wouldn't grow. The ornery character, Urbano.
I was going through the chapters of the first part of the book, and there was one that kind of perked my curiosity, running numbers for chocolate. Is there a story behind that too?
Oh, there is a story behind that. I was probably 6 years old, and I was outside playing one day, and one of the neighborhood men who sat on the stoop, who collected little slips of paper all day and put them into his hat bin. Now, those little slips of paper I know today are number slips. And this was long before the lottery and legal. This was illegal numbers running. And one day he called to me, Linda. So I went. He had all these pieces of paper and he said, here, I'll give these to you. Go across the street to the candy store. They'll give you a bar of chocolate. I had never been in that candy store. It looked like it was dusty and dirty. It didn't even look like a candy store because it wasn't. But I said, well, I'm not allowed to cross the street. Come on, I'll cross you. And he crossed me. And I went inside and a man came from the back. And I said, I have these pieces of paper. And Mr. Galliano said you'd give me a chocolate bar. And the man laughed. Okay, you don't want this candy in the case. It's old. I'll get you a chocolate bar. And he goes in the back and he brings me a chocolate bar. Well, this was a great gig, I thought. So every day I would go up to the men on the stoop and they'd give me the papers and cross the street and I'd go in and I'd get a chocolate bar. Until one day I come home and went upstairs and for dinner, and my mother looked at me and I must not have wiped my mouth. And she said, where did you get chocolate? So I didn't know there was anything wrong. So I tell her the whole story. Well, unfortunately, when my father came home from work, my mother told him, which she probably shouldn't have, but she did. And he was livid. And he left the house, was gone for maybe 10, 20 minutes. He came back, and that was the end of my chocolate gig. The men on the stoop didn't even look at me anymore when I was outside playing. So I think he told them, you do not use my daughter to run numbers. But at the time, I didn't know I was doing anything wrong, and I enjoyed the chocolate bars.
Yes, it was like the naiveness of how old were you
I was
at that
about
time?
6 years old. So yeah, I had a
You
great
would,
numbers
right?
running gig at 6. I tell my sons this story now, and they can't believe it.
So when did things started to change in Larimer Avenue, or maybe in your life,
Yeah.
that you
Well,
started to see
we
this
left.
richness, so to speak, started to fade away?
we left in the late 1950s, and it was still not too different at the time. But in the early 1960s, I would say, there was a sprawl to the suburbs. A lot of the families that had lived in Larimer for a couple of generations moved to the suburbs. A redevelopment, the city was going through a huge redevelopment plan. A lot of the neighborhood stores and houses were abandoned. Many of them were razed, and they began building public housing and apartments. And it completely changed the texture of the community, because these were all new people who didn't know each other, who didn't have history there. It was a more diverse neighborhood, but living in a high rise or a public housing was not the same as all the little clapboard houses or all of the old Italian stores. By the 1980s, I would say the neighborhood was gone. Most of those buildings were completely razed. And by the time I drove down there a handful of years ago, it was completely empty. I'm happy to say that now there is some revitalization that is beginning at the end of the street. Little by little, I see little townhouses going up and some new investment. The school that was my elementary school that had been abandoned for many, many years is being renovated now into apartments.
Because there was a beautiful church that actually got turned down. That I thought it was a disgrace, just because it was so beautiful from outside. Obviously, it had been boarded up for many, many years, but driving by, not seeing that humongous structure, you probably remember what I'm referring to, because
this was my family's church, Our Lady Help of Christians Church on Meadow Street. This nurtured the souls of 3 generations of my family. My grandparents, my mother was married there. I made all of my first Holy Communion and everything there. And when they closed it, my mother got on the phone and called the bishop and scolded him for closing it. But the population was gone. They couldn't support the church anymore. And it remained closed for many years. And then it began to deteriorate, and crumble. And eventually it was torn down, and it's now a parking lot. So there's some pain involved in this, but the school will be revitalized and made into apartments. The playground across from the school has all new equipment and new grass and a new fence. And so I'm hoping that this neighborhood will come back for future neighborhood girls.
Yes, as I said, it's becoming a new neighborhood, so to speak. It will have to write its own story.
Exactly.
But definitely one that might not have the same layers, at least for now, that Larimer Avenue had for many decades. The change of the neighborhood, it might not be, time-wise the same thing, but you had also some family losses of, you lost your beloved Aunt Mim, and also your father. So how it's kind of the loss of the community, a personal loss. How did you deal with these big feelings,
Well, at first, not so well. Because what I tried to do, Viviana, was my way of keeping these people alive that I loved so much and I missed so much, and the way of keeping them alive for me was to keep the traditions alive. So I had to make the same food, put it on the same plate, to the point where I had this compulsion for doing everything that they did, to the point where I think I made my sons pazza. I mean, I made them crazy with me trying to hold on to everything. I would, have these plates and dishes and say to my son, why don't you take this plate? This serving plate belonged to Aunt Mim, or this was my mother's. And, young people, they don't want all our old stuff. And while they appreciate the traditions, and they too loved those people that they knew as children, they don't want to feel tied to doing everything exactly the same. And so in the later part of the book, there's a chapter called 3 Fishes and a Ham. And this is when I come to a realization, the Feast of the Seven Fishes I hung on to. I bought the same food. I made the same food that my grandmother made and then my aunt made. And after they were all dead and gone, I insisted that we still make the same food, even though nobody wanted to eat that bacala, even though that calamari was so much work to clean. And finally, then I got down to 5. And then I got down to 3 because my family was getting smaller. And one day, a few years ago, my younger son came over to see me about 2 weeks before Christmas. And he said, I have something to ask you. Okay, what? I'm wondering, what is he setting me up for here? He said, is it okay if I bring a ham Christmas Eve? Everything inside my head was screaming, no.
Oh,
Are
it was
you
like
kidding me?
a heart.
It was like, just stick the knife in, twist it a couple of times. But fortunately, thank God, I had the wisdom to stop, take a breath and say, sure, it's okay. Because I learned, and it was a hard lesson to learn, and it took me a lot of years, but I actually learned it through the writing of this book. You cannot dictate to the next generation what their traditions are. And it dawned on me too. I'm sure that my mother and my aunt didn't do the same thing that generations before them did in Italy. And I'm sure that my granddaughter is not going to do the same thing. And so what if it's not the same? If they're with people they love and they have the values and they remember some of the stories, they can be free to make some of their own traditions. That was a hard lesson to let go, to let go of that.
Yes, and what happens as I said, I'm still going through that phase myself. Once I moved to the US right out of university, I just wanted to do anything that was American. And then only when I got a little older, I started to, it was at work, and traveling, wherever. My priorities were different at that time. And I started to work also for a magazine, Primo magazine, and we would get letters in from, the readers sharing their personal stories, and I could not really relate to them yet because I was still the one that came with an airplane ticket to the US, and it was so foreign to me, even though we were all Italian. And it does take, again, maturity, getting also mature in life. And I'm within an association, Donne Italiane in Pittsburgh, and we have people from different regions, and it becomes now a need to maintain those traditions because it's our link to the motherland, the one that makes us feel we belong somewhere. Because when we are in the US, we're the Italians. When we go back to Italy, we're the Americans.
Yes.
And so food seems to be always a common thread between the two. But I'm sure, we do things a little differently from our mothers and grandmothers. My grandmother, the Altieri grandmother, was a wonderful cook. She was a stay-at-home mom, so I'd seen it. And making food when I was also growing up, I was a little girl, I would go with my little hands and help her out making orecchiette. My mom was a good cook, but she was also professional. She was a doctor, so she always, provided and cooked for us. But it was not until, unfortunately, we lost her, then my sister and I and my brother started to say, oh, that bridge between generation is gone. Either we do something about it, or the richness is lost. So we took upon ourselves to do some of the dishes that are in the tradition. And I love to get my nephews, they're all boys, involved, and they really, really enjoy. We have some funny videos from like 15 years ago with their little hands, as little as I was when I was with my grandmother. But I'm sure we're not doing identical, we do our best. But evolution seems to be the cure, accepting it, the medicine, kind of your conclusion. so to speak, of this. It feels like the book also had probably a very cathartic feel to it.
Very much. It was transformative for me. I mean, when I started writing, it was like, I want to write these stories down for Alexandra, my granddaughter, so she will know who these people were. She will know where she came from and who she came from. Then it began, oh, I think I'd like to write these in essay form and publish some of them. But then through the writing, I realized I'm going through a transformation here. I'm learning about my life. I'm learning what to hold on to, what I don't have to hold on to, how I can hold on with an open hand, what I can give these next generations, and what they will give and create for themselves. And so it was very much learning about my neighborhood, my Italian American ancestry, but learning about myself as a mother, as a grandmother, and how life evolves,
Mm-hmm.
And
I do remember.
Orchietti. I mean, it's very much from Puglia. And I was just there this past fall and went to a restaurant where the owner of the restaurant, a kind woman, sat me down and taught me how to make orchietti because I couldn't remember. So sometimes just those little things will take you back.
Indeed, I have also, in addition to that, I'm really studying some of the elements again of this older Italianità that was not part of my, cultural, background, so to speak. And it's becoming, I don't want to say an obsession, but it's just like one thread leads to another. I think eventually that is my own journey, that will complete itself when it's time to. But again, it started a few years ago with, Istituto Mondo Italiano and the stories and assisting people, whether they're becoming citizens. So they tell me about who came from their family and their journey and so forth. So everyone adds a little tassel to this huge puzzle. I don't remember if it was with your son or your granddaughter, or something about looking at Italian books together.
Yeah, when my granddaughter was just a baby, she's 9 years old now, I bought her these little books. That one is called La Frutta, La Musica, and there's another one. And it shows the picture of a musical instrument or a fruit, and it shows the words in English and Italian. Well, now she's 9 years old, but the joke is we still have bilingual books that we sit and read together. But as you know from knowing me, Viviana, neither one of us are still yet fluent in Italian. It's still a struggle. I'm always the student. And when I'm in Italy and I start hearing it again, okay, then I remember a little bit. And then I forget it when I get back home. So, but it's something that I want Alex to know, that there is a part of her that is Italian. And she likes to talk about that. We make pizzelles together. She tells me, ti amo molto, nonna. I mean, that's enough for me.
I have a question. This is more about the process or a piece of advice for those that would want to dive into a similar experience of documenting family history, family stories. Would you have some recommendations on how to go about it?
Yeah, I think so. It depends on what level. I mean, my goal was to publish a book. I didn't know that was my goal in the beginning, but that was my ultimate goal. But in the beginning, I just wanted to write down these stories. So I would say, if you want to preserve some family memories, begin to write them down. Don't worry if the writing is good or what, just get them down on paper. And oftentimes the struggle is to tease out those memories a little bit. And I found I actually teach a little 4-week course for adults at Osher at CMU, at Carnegie Mellon University.
Yeah, I do the Italian.
About how to tease out those memories And a couple of things I tell people is, first of all, look at old photographs. Sometimes the old photograph you're looking at will remind you of something else that's, oh, what's in the background? Oh, yeah, I remember this, or I remember that. The other thing is to make a list of all the people you can remember from your childhood. Maybe it was a teacher, maybe it was a neighbor. For me, it was maybe Mr. Carrazza's grocery store or whatever. And those will help jog memories. And finally, to draw a map of your first house or a little apartment or your school or your street. What was on the street? What was across the street from my school? And this will help tease out those memories, and then just write about them.
And then eventually the organization of the book, sometimes it might be chronological, sometimes it might take a different path, right? Based on I don't know, experiences and emotions.
As
so
long
it
as
doesn't
there, as long as there is some narrative arc there, you know, so that ties them together. Or you could just have a collection of various stories and essays. Some people want to try and get them published. Many writers preserve them for their family. So it doesn't matter what the ultimate goal is. I think the important thing is to do that retelling of the stories and get them down on paper for yourself, but for your children, your grandchildren, your family members.
I'm also a big advocate of oral history, trying to get something recorded when people go off and they just give you more stories and details that you would never have expected by just asking a question and let them flow. Right. And then, you know, sometimes depending also on the state of mind of the person, they might be very precise, or some others you kind of, but also it's a process when I can that I like to engage in.
That's very wise.
And even because, I mean, there is also the sound of that voice that you can't call anymore, or you can't hear that, you know, for people that might have a recent loss, might provide some healing and comfort as they're dealing with their loss. Linda, this has been a pleasure. Let's remind our viewers and listeners how they can get hold of you or secure a copy of Neighborhood Girl. And I'm already inviting you to maybe do a book signing at Istituto Mondo Italiano, because I think it would be lovely to have you back. And again, a story is very, very, very relatable for not only the local audience, but others that have lived in such a lively Italian enclave. But share the details on how to secure the book, and then we'll say our goodbye.
The book is Neighborhood Girl, and it's available on my publisher's website, Sunbury, Sunbury Press. And it's also available on Amazon in paperback or Kindle, you know, an ebook. And it was just out last week. And so it's just being shipped now this week. So it's very new and it's very exciting. And I would love to come and do a reading with you and sign some books, and it would be great fun. Yeah, I'd enjoy that, Viviana. I appreciate it. And I appreciate our conversation today. This is great fun for me.
Thank you. Thank you. The honor, it's all mine. But unfortunately, our time together is up, and il Big Ben ha detto stop. It's time for us to say arrivederci alla prossima, and we want to thank you for tuning in into the program. And if you have any questions or comments, or if you have any topic you would like us to address, please contact us at theitalianradiohour@gmail.com. We would love to hear from you. And remember, if you or any of your family and friends have missed a prior episode or would like to listen to this episode again, please visit our website at www.istitutomondoitaliano.org and click on the Italian Radio Hour tab. You can also subscribe to the Italian Radio Hour on YouTube or where you catch your favorite podcasts. I would like to thank again my guest, Linda. Schifino, although she prefers. Before we go, there is a little anecdote about what you do when you go to Italy for your last.
I know. My name, Schifino, is Schifino. But as soon as I got to the point in life where I learned that that had a negative connotation, when I go to Italy, I spell it Scifi. So people say Schifino.
So we would like to thank our guest, Linda Schifino, Schifino. Our sponsor, Istituto Mondo Italiano. And until next time, alla prossima. Ciao, ciao.
Ciao.